November 1943. Tarawa Atoll. A Marine sniper crouches in the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker, his hands trembling. Not from fear, from rage. 300 yards away, a Japanese machine gun nest rakes the beach where his brothers are dying. He can see them, clear as day through the 5-power Lyman scope mounted on his Springfield rifle. He can see the enemy gunners reloading, shifting positions, laughing, but he can't do anything about it. His scope, designed for target shooting at Camp Perry, not combat, wobbles with every breath. The crosshairs dance, the glass fogs in the tropical heat. And even if he could make the shot, 5-power magnification means he's guessing at details. Beyond 200 yards, the Marine pulls the trigger. Anyway, misses the bolt action. Springfield ejects the spent casing with that distinctive metallic clang. He works the bolt, chambers another round, and fires again. Another miss. The Japanese machine gun continues its deadly work. That night, lying in a shell crater, this unnamed Marine would write in his journal, "Our scopes are worthless here. We need something better. Anything." He had no idea that 6,000 miles away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a German immigrant gunsmith had already created exactly what he needed. A scope the military had examined, tested and rejected as too fragile, too long, too complicated for modern warfare. They called it worthless. History would prove them spectacularly wrong. Problem, context, establishment, 800, 1,000 words. To understand how one man's worthless design changed the Pacific War, we need to go back to 1928. John Unertl stepped off the boat from Germany with little money, limited English but extraordinary skills. He'd worked as an optical craftsman in the old country, grinding lenses by hand, understanding light the way a concert pianist understands music. In America, he found work at the J.W. Fecker Target Scope Company in Pittsburgh, where he learned the American way of doing business, which is to say, he learned there was a market hungry for precision. Target shooters in the 1920s were obsessed, not casual enthusiasts, obsessed. Men who would spend an entire Sunday adjusting their rifles by thousandths of an inch. Men who knew the difference between a 5-inch group and a 4-inch group at 300 yards could mean the difference between a trophy and going home. Empty-handed, Unertl understood these men because he was one of them. By 1934, he'd saved enough to open his own shop, the John Unertl Optical Company, a modest operation in a Pittsburgh warehouse district. He didn't mass-produce, couldn't compete with the big manufacturers on price, so he competed on quality instead. His scopes were different. Most telescopic sights of the era were short, stubby things mounted directly to the rifle. They worked well enough, but they had a fundamental problem. When a rifle fires, it recoils backward. That scope, mounted rigidly to the rifle, comes backward too, fast. If your eye is too close to the ocular lens, you're going to have a bad day. Shooters called it scope bite, the telltale crescent-shaped cut above the eyebrow that marked you as either inexperienced or unlucky. Unertl solved this with elegant simplicity. His scopes were long, sometimes stretching nearly the entire length of the rifle barrel. They sat in special mounts that allowed the scope tube to slide forward and backward, independent of the rifle itself. When you pulled the trigger, the rifle kicked back, but the scope stayed relatively stationary, floating in its mounts. A spring mechanism would then gently return the scope to its original position for the next shot. It was brilliant. Shooters could get their eye right up to the ocular lens without fear. The long tube meant higher magnification without distortion. And because the scope wasn't rigidly attached, the delicate glass elements inside didn't suffer the violent shock of recoil with every shot. Target shooters loved them. Unertl scopes began winning competitions. 8-power magnification, 10-power, 14-power for the truly fanatical. Crystal clear glass. Precise adjustments down to quarter minute of angle, meaning you could adjust your point of impact by roughly a quarter inch at 100 yards for civilians shooting paper targets at known distances in perfect weather. Unertl scopes were as close to perfection as 1930s technology could achieve. But for the military, when the United States Marine Corps first looked at Unertl scopes in the late 1930s, they saw problems everywhere. Too long. The scope extended nearly 30 inches on some models. How would a Marine crawl through mud with that thing jutting from his rifle? Too fragile. That sliding mechanism. Those delicate internal adjustments. What happens when you drop it? When sand gets in the rings? When humidity warps the tube? Too slow. After each shot, a Marine would have to manually pull the scope back into position if the spring failed or was removed. In combat, that second of delay could mean death. Too expensive. A single unertl scope cost more than 3 standard-issue rifles, and 2 specialized. These were designed for calm target ranges where you could take your time, adjust for windage and elevation between shots, fire at paper targets that didn't shoot back. The Marine Corps' conclusion in 1938 was unambiguous, not suitable for military service. But then December 7, 1941, changed everything. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island. Within weeks, the United States was fighting a war across the Pacific against an enemy that had been preparing for years. And Marine snipers quickly discovered they were bringing the wrong tools to the fight. The standard Marine sniper rifle in early 1942 was the M1903, Springfield with a Winchester A5 scope. 5-power magnification, barely adequate for shooting at 200 yards. Beyond that, you were essentially guessing. The Japanese, by contrast, had been refining sniping techniques in China since the 1930s. Their marksmen were skilled, patient, and equipped with decent optics. More importantly, they understood jungle warfare in a way American forces did not. On Guadalcanal in August 1942, Marine snipers found themselves outranged and outgunned. Japanese snipers would establish positions 400, 500, 600 yards from American lines, far enough that standard infantry rifles couldn't touch them, close enough that they could pick off officers, radio operators, and medics with methodical precision. When American snipers tried to engage these distant threats, their 5-power scopes made accurate identification nearly impossible. Was that a Japanese soldier or a tree stump? A rifle barrel or a branch? Frustrated Marine commanders began sending urgent reports back to headquarters. We need better scopes. We need longer range. We need something that actually works in the Pacific. Meanwhile, in late 1940, Captain George O. Van Orden of the Marine Corps Equipment Board had been conducting tests. His job: determine the best possible rifle and scope combination for Marine snipers. Van Orden was thorough. He tested dozens of rifles and scopes under field conditions. He measured accuracy at various ranges. He evaluated durability, clarity, ease of use. His final report, submitted in January 1941, was crystal clear. The Winchester Model 70 rifle with an 8-power unertl scope. That combination, Van Orden argued, represented the finest sniper system available anywhere in the world. But the director of the Division of Plans and Policies rejected the recommendation. Why? Because, and this is important, Van Orden wanted to use the Winchester Model 70, a civilian hunting rifle, not the military's standard-issue M1903 Springfield. That was seen as logistically problematic. Different spare parts, different training, different everything. As for the unertl scope, all those old concerns resurfaced. Too fragile, too long, too complicated. The rejection was filed away. Van Orden's report gathered dust, and Marines continued dying on Pacific Islands because they couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. The turning point came in early 1942, but not through official channels. With Japanese forces advancing across the Pacific, the Marine Corps desperately needed sniper rifles immediately. Not next year. Not after proper trials. Now. The Army, facing the same problem, had already adopted a compromise solution: the M1903A4 sniper rifle. Take the standard Springfield rifle, remove the iron sights, bolt on a Weaver 330C scope, a civilian hunting scope with 2.5 power magnification, and call it good enough. It wasn't good enough. The M1903A4 had a laundry list of problems. The scope was mounted so low that you had to remove the bolt to load it. The Weaver 330C, designed for deer hunting at 200 yards, offered barely more magnification than the old Winchester A5. And because the iron sights had been removed, if the scope broke or got damaged, the rifle became essentially useless. But it was in production, it was cheap, and it was available. The Marines looked at the M1903A4 and said, "We can do better." Someone, history doesn't record exactly who, remembered Van Orden's report. That Winchester Model 70, with the unertl scope, the one that had been rejected, What if we kept the inertial scope but mounted it on the Springfield instead? It was a compromise. The Springfield M1903 had been the Marines' rifle since before World War I. There were thousands in inventory. More. Importantly, some of these were special guns, national match rifles and special target rifles that had been hand-selected for accuracy, carefully tuned for competitive shooting. These rifles could print groups under 2 inches at 100 yards. In the right hands, with the right scope, they could reach out past 1,000 yards. The decision was made. The Marines would create their own sniper rifle, M1, 3A1 National Match Rifles. Inertial 8-power scopes, combined in a way the military had previously dismissed as worthless. But there was a problem. John Inertial's company was small. In 1942, he employed maybe a dozen craftsmen. His annual production ran to a few hundred scopes. High-end target scopes for civilian competitors who would wait 6 months for a custom order. Now the Marine Corps wanted thousands, immediately, for combat use. Under conditions that would destroy normal scopes, Inertial, now in his 50s, faced the challenge of his career. He couldn't simply scale up production. His scopes required precision work, hand-fitted parts, individually ground lenses, careful assembly by skilled technicians. Rush that process and quality would suffer. But he also couldn't deliver scopes slowly while Marines died for lack of proper equipment. His solution? Adapt. For the military contract, Inertial made critical modifications to his civilian design. The most important, he removed the return spring. Wait. Removed? That spring was one of the scope's signature features, gently returning the tube to position after each shot. Why take it out combat conditions? Inertial realized that in the jungles of the Pacific, where sand, mud, moisture, and salt spray were constants, a spring mechanism was a liability. Springs could corrode. They could gum up with debris. They could break at precisely the wrong moment. Without the spring, the scope would slide backward during recoil and then just stay there. The Marine would have to manually pull it forward into position before firing again. It was less convenient, but it was more reliable. The military scopes were marked clearly on the tube, J. Inertial USMC Sniper, followed by a serial number. 8-power magnification, though technically, due to optical physics, they were actually 7.8 power. Close enough for government work. The scope itself was a work of art, 29 inches long, 1-inch tube diameter. The objective lens was massive for its time, gathering light efficiently even in the dim conditions of jungle canopy or dawn light. The ocular lens featured a rubber eyepiece for comfortable viewing, but the real magic was in the adjustment system. Unlike modern scopes with internal adjustment turrets, the Inertial used external mounts. Windage and elevation adjustments were made by physically moving the rear mount, which held the scope in different positions relative to the bore. Each click of the adjustment knob moved the point of impact by roughly 1/4 inch at 100 yards. This system had advantages and disadvantages. Advantage: extremely precise adjustments possible. Disadvantage: if you bumped those adjustment knobs crawling through the jungle, your zero could shift without you knowing. The mounting system itself was ingenious. The front mount was a simple collar that clamped to the barrel. The rear mount attached to a block screwed into the receiver ring. The scope tube sat in these mounts with just enough clearance to slide freely during recoil, but not so much that it wobbled. Assembly of each rifle was painstaking. Marine armorers at the Philadelphia Depot received the National Match Springfields and Inertial scopes in late 1942. They couldn't just bolt them together. Each rifle had to be individually fitted. First, they installed the mounting blocks, carefully aligning them with the bore. Then they modified the wooden handguard, cutting a relief slot so it wouldn't interfere with the front mount. The bright bolts on these National Match rifles, polished steel instead of the standard, Parkerized finish, were blued to reduce glare that might give away a sniper's position. Then came the tricky part. Zeroing, a Marine armorer would fire the rifle, checking where the bullet struck relative to where the crosshairs indicated, then adjust the mounts. Fire again, adjust, fire again. This process could take hours to get a proper zero at 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards. Only then was the rifle considered ready for combat. The first batch of M1903A1 inertial sniper rifles reached Marine units in the Pacific in mid-1943. Not many, maybe 80 or 90 rifles for an entire division, but enough to make a difference, or so everyone hoped. The reality was more complicated. The first after-action reports were devastating. A Marine Raider Battalion using the new rifles on New Georgia Island in August 1943 filed a report stating the rifles had no value. The scopes fogged constantly in the humidity. The long tubes caught on vegetation. The delicate adjustments shifted with rough handling. Marines complained that the scopes were too fragile for jungle warfare. At Cape Gloucester, the 1st Marine Division reported they were unable to make effective use of the M1903A1 new inertial rifles due to climate and terrain. The Marine Corps' reaction was swift and damning. February 16, 1944. Memo from the Commandant to the Quartermaster was blunt. The inertial 8X sniper telescope has not proved effective in combat. Accordingly, you are requested to cancel existing contracts for this item. The plan was to dump the inertials and adopt the Army's M1903A4 with its inferior 2.5 power scope, John Inertial's design. The scope that competitive shooters worshipped was being officially declared worthless for military service. But then something unexpected happened. The terrain changed. New Georgia and Cape Gloucester were dense jungle, visibility rarely extended beyond 100 yards. Short-range engagements where a 5-power scope and a 10-power scope made little practical difference. But when Marines assaulted Saipan in June 1944, the battlefield was different. Saipan had open terrain, cane fields, rocky hillsides, long sight lines extending 500, 600, 800 yards, sometimes more. Suddenly, the inertial's 8-power magnification mattered. A lot. Marine snipers could sit in concealment and clearly observe Japanese positions at distances that had previously been hazy blurs. They could identify targets, select priority threats, and engage with precision that was simply impossible with lower-powered scopes. One Marine scout sniper later recalled, "On Saipan, we found the inertial quite adequate. We found no faults with the scope." The battles of Peleliu in September 1944 and Iwo Jima in February 1945 reinforced this. Open terrain, long ranges, conditions where an 8-power scope gave Marine snipers a decisive advantage over enemy forces. Japanese infantry, equipped with iron-sighted Arisaka rifles effective to maybe 300 yards, suddenly found themselves facing an invisible enemy who could strike from twice that distance. Japanese soldiers would be walking along a trail, hear a shot echo across a hillside, and one of their comrades would drop dead. No muzzle flash visible, no shooter apparent, terror. That's what the inertial scope brought to the Pacific battlefield. Not just the ability to kill at long range, but the psychological impact of being killed by someone you couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't fight back against. Marine snipers developed techniques to maximize the scope's effectiveness. They learned to protect the scope in a micarta carrying tube when moving through jungle. They improvised cleaning methods using whatever materials they could scavenge. Some discovered that a strip of rubber from a truck inner tube could serve as a makeshift return spring, stretching from the front mount to the rear mount, automatically pulling the scope back into battery after each shot. They learned to zero their rifles at 600 yards, the distance where most engagements occurred. At that range, the heavy .30-06 bullet from the Springfield had enough velocity for clean kills but hadn't dropped so much that holdover became guesswork, and they learned patience. Marine sniper on Okinawa might wait for hours in a concealed position, eye to the inertial, watching a distant ridgeline, waiting for that one moment when a Japanese officer exposed himself for just a second, one shot, one kill, then melt away before return fire could locate him. The inertial's clarity made this possible. At 8-power magnification, a human figure at 600 yards filled enough of the scope's field of view that you could distinguish officers from enlisted men, identify weapon types, spot ammunition carriers and radio operators. This wasn't random sniping. This was surgical removal of enemy leadership and support personnel. The impact was measurable. On Okinawa in April 1945, Marine divisions reported that sniper operations with the M1903A1 inertial rifles were being employed with great success. Japanese units, particularly in the southern part of the island where the terrain favored long-range shooting, reported significant casualties among their officer corps. By this point, the Marine Corps had reversed its earlier condemnation. A report from April 1945 acknowledged that while some units still struggled with the unearthly and dense jungle, the scope had proved invaluable in open terrain. But here's the most remarkable part of this story. Remember Captain George O. Van Orden, the man whose 1940 report recommending the unearthly scope had been rejected? He never stopped believing he was right. During the war, Van Orden continued to advocate for his original recommendation, the Winchester Model 70 with an unearthly 8-power scope. And while the Marine Corps never officially adopted this combination during World War II, a significant number of Model 70s somehow made their way into combat. Individual Marines, particularly those with competitive shooting backgrounds, purchased Winchester Model 70s with their own money and brought them to the Pacific. Unit armorers would mount unearthly scopes on these civilian rifles, creating unofficial sniper systems that existed outside the formal table of organization and equipment. These Van Orden rifles, as they came to be called, were legendary among Marine snipers. More accurate than the Springfield, smoother action, better triggers. Combined with the unearthly scope, they represented the finest sniper system available to any military force in World War. And here's the kicker: when the Marine Corps finally developed an official sniper doctrine in the 1960s for the Vietnam War, guess what they chose? Winchester Model 70, unearthly scope. 25 years after Van Orden's original recommendation, the Marines finally admitted he'd been right all along. By August 1945, as the war in the Pacific ground toward its terrible conclusion, the M1903A1 unearthly sniper rifle had become legendary, not among the general public. These rifles were never mass-produced like the M1 Garand or the M1 Carbine. They never appeared in training films or war bond posters. But among Marine snipers, among the men who actually used them, the unearthly scope had earned grudging respect. The numbers tell the story. The Marine Corps accepted approximately 1,650 unearthly USMC sniper scopes during the war. But there were only about 1,047 national match and special target M1903A1 rifles available for conversion. This means not every scope was mounted. Some were kept as spares, some went to training units, and some ended up in the hands of individual Marines who mounted them on whatever accurate rifle they could find. Compare this to the Army's M1903A4, produced in the tens of thousands, and you realize the unearthly-equipped rifles were rare even among snipers. But rarity doesn't diminish impact. Consider the mathematics of long-range precision shooting. At 400 yards, the Army's M1903A4 with its 2.5 power scope made a human target appear roughly as large as it would look with the naked eye at 160 yards. Possible to hit, but requiring excellent vision and steady nerves. The unearthly at 8 power made that same target appear as it would at 50 yards. Suddenly you could see details. Uniform insignia, weapons, whether the target was looking your way. At 600 yards, a common engagement distance in the Pacific, the difference was even more dramatic. The 2.5 power scope showed you a blur. The 8 power unearthly showed you a person. This translated to effectiveness. While exact kill counts are impossible to verify, many sniper kills went unrecorded, and many more involved supporting fire rather than confirmed kills. Marine after-action reports consistently noted that units with unearthly-equipped snipers achieved better results at longer ranges than those with lower-powered optics. On Okinawa, one Marine division reported that snipers equipped with the M1903A1 unearthly could effectively engage targets out to 1,000 yards under favorable conditions. Not a guaranteed hit at that range. The 30-06 bullet drops nearly 200 inches at 1,000 yards, but possible with proper holdover and wind reading. By contrast, snipers with the M1903A4 were limited to about 500 yards as a practical maximum, and even that required exceptional skill. 500 yards versus 1,000 yards, double the effective range. In combat, that extra range meant Marine snipers could dominate terrain that would otherwise be contested ground. Japanese forces learned to stay out of open areas, to move only at night, to keep their heads down whenever the possibility of American snipers existed. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be overstated. Japanese soldier who knew that American snipers might be watching from a ridge half a mile away, a distance where he couldn't shoot back, effectively had to make impossible choices. Stay pinned in cover and accomplish nothing? Move and risk sudden death from an invisible enemy? This paralysis, this fear, was as valuable as the actual kills. But the story doesn't end in 1945. When World War II ended, the Marine Corps conducted a thorough evaluation of its sniper program. The conclusion was nuanced. The M1903A1 unertl rifle was acknowledged as highly effective in open terrain but less suitable for dense jungle. The scope itself was praised for its clarity and magnification, but criticized for fragility and bulk. The sliding mount system was noted as clever, but prone to problems if not maintained properly. The recommendation? Keep them in inventory, but continue developing better solutions. Those better solutions took decades to arrive. Through the Korean War in the 1950s, Marines continued using M1903A1T unertl rifles. In the mountainous terrain of Korea, where long-range shooting was common, these rifles proved their worth all over again. Some of the same scopes that had been used in the Pacific saw service in Korea, testament to their durability despite earlier concerns. Then, in the 1960s, as America became involved in Vietnam, the Marine Corps finally developed a standardized sniper doctrine. They needed a dedicated sniper rifle, something modern, something better than the 60-year-old Springfield. After extensive testing, they selected the Winchester Model 70 with a unertl 10-power scope. Captain George O. Van Orden, who had recommended exactly this combination in 1940, lived to see his vindication. The rifle he'd championed before Pearl Harbor became the Marine Corps' official sniper system. A generation later, the unertl scope, dismissed as worthless, became the gold standard. Marine sniper Carlos Hathcock, legendary for his exploits in Vietnam, used a Winchester Model 70 with a unertl scope for many of his confirmed kills. When asked about his equipment, Hathcock praised the unertl's clarity and precision. The same qualities that target shooters had appreciated in the 1930s proved equally valuable in the jungles of Vietnam. The final irony? By the 1970s, modern scope technology had advanced to the point where sealed, internally adjusted scopes could match the unertl's optical quality without the bulk and complexity of external adjustments. The unique sliding mount system, once necessary to protect delicate optics from recoil, became obsolete. But for nearly 4 decades, from 1942 to the late 1970s, John Unertl's worthless design served as the finest sniper optic in the American arsenal. Today, an original unertl USMC sniper scope is a collector's item worth thousands of dollars. The rifles they were mounted on, M1903A1 National Match Springfields with those distinctive scope mounts, can sell for 10 times that amount. But their true value can't be measured in dollars. These scopes represent something larger than their optical specifications or their place in military history. They represent the power of specialization in an age of mass production. John Unertl never tried to compete with the giants of American manufacturing. He couldn't produce cheaper scopes than Weaver or Lyman. He couldn't match their marketing budgets or distribution networks. What he could do, what he did do, was make scopes that were uncompromisingly excellent at one specific task: putting a bullet exactly where the shooter intended, at distances where lesser optics failed. That focus on excellence, that refusal to compromise, is what made his scopes worthless for general military use. Too expensive, too specialized, too difficult to mass produce. But for the Marines who needed to reach out past 600 yards, past 800 yards, out to that ragged edge of 1,000 yards where the bullet drops like a thrown stone and the wind can push it 3 feet sideways, Unertl's scopes weren't worthless, they were priceless. The broader lesson resonates beyond military history. How many times has an expert solution been rejected in favor of a good enough mass-produced alternative? How many specialists have been told their work is too expensive, too complicated, too impractical for real-world use? Sometimes those criticisms are valid. Sometimes good enough really is sufficient. But sometimes in the jungles of the Pacific, on the ridges of Korea, in the rice paddies of Vietnam, good enough isn't good enough. Sometimes you need the specialist. Sometimes you need the tool that does one thing superbly well, even if it costs 10 times more and requires a trained expert to use it properly. John Inertle understood this. Captain Van Orden understood this. And the Marine snipers who carried those long, ungainly rifles with their delicate scopes through some of the worst combat conditions imaginable, they understood this better than anyone. The Inertle Optical Company closed its doors in 2008, unable to compete in a market dominated by cheaper imports and modern technology. But the scopes John Inertle made in his Pittsburgh workshop still work, still hold zero, still deliver that crystal clear view that won competitions in the 1930s and won battles in the 1940s. A scope dismissed as worthless. A design that military experts rejected. A tool so specialized that only a few thousand were ever made for combat use. And yet, when it mattered most, when Marines needed to reach out across impossible distances and make that one perfect shot that could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, John Inertle's worthless scope made them unstoppable.